stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Jesus. But nobody was watching him. They were watching his disease. For years, his condition had made him an outcast. Wherever he went, people stepped away. Wherever he appeared, conversation stopped. He lived under a label that was more powerful than his name, unclean. But on this day, something inside him broke through the fear. He walked toward Jesus. The crowd probably expected Jesus to step back. Instead, the man fell to his knees and said, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." Then Jesus did something that shocked everyone watching. He reached out his hand and touched him. But why? Why would Jesus deliberately touch the very person everyone else was commanded to avoid? And why, immediately after cleansing him, would Jesus tell him to go and show himself to a priest? The answer reaches far beyond this man's healing. It takes us back into the ancient laws of Leviticus, into the mystery of clean and unclean, and into a spiritual battle that had been unfolding throughout Scripture. Because this wasn't merely the story of a sick man becoming well, it was a revelation of who Jesus really was, and a glimpse of the greater cleansing he came to bring. And once you see what was happening in that moment, you may never read this miracle the same way again. Imagine living in a world where your condition could determine where you lived, whom you could approach, and whether you could worship alongside everyone else. That was the terrifying reality surrounding the man who came to Jesus. Leviticus 13 and 14 contain detailed instructions concerning skin diseases and ceremonial uncleanness. A person identified as unclean could be separated from the community until a priest examined the condition and declared that person clean. So this man wasn't simply fighting a physical problem. He was fighting isolation. Every step away from the crowd was a reminder that he no longer belonged among them. Every face that turned away told him the same message: stay back. And perhaps that is what makes his approach to Jesus so astonishing. He knew the rules. He knew the danger of rejection. He knew that people might drive him away. But something had changed. Somewhere along the way, he had heard about Jesus. He had heard that the blind could see, the suffering could find relief, and the impossible was happening wherever Jesus went. So now, carrying years of rejection, he stepped forward. The crowd saw an unclean man approaching, but Jesus saw someone who needed mercy. And as the man drew closer, an invisible battle was already unfolding, not between armies, but between despair and faith, isolation and restoration, uncleanness and cleansing. Then the man fell before Jesus, and what he said next revealed the depth of his faith. The man fell at Jesus' feet. He didn't demand a miracle. He didn't tell Jesus what he had to do. He simply said, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." Those words are easy to read quickly, but they reveal something extraordinary. Notice what the man did not question. He didn't say, "Can you?" He said, "If you will." He believed Jesus had the power. What he placed in Jesus' hands was the decision. That is faith with surrender. The man understood that Jesus was able to change his condition, but he approached him without trying to control the outcome. And perhaps that is where the spiritual battle becomes personal. Because faith does not always begin when we understand what God will do. Sometimes faith begins when we trust him even before we know what he will do. The man had lived with rejection long enough to know that human beings could say no. But now he was standing before someone whose authority was different. He had heard the stories. He had seen the crowds. And now he was asking the question that every desperate heart eventually asks. "Lord, are you willing?" Jesus looked at him. The crowd waited. The man waited. And then came the words that would change everything. "I am willing. Be clean." But before the miracle could even be understood, Jesus did something no one expected. He reached out his hand. The crowd watched as Jesus reached toward the man. Then came the moment nobody expected. Jesus touched him. Think about what that meant. For years, people had probably avoided touching this man. Yet Jesus did not keep his distance. He moved toward him. And then Jesus said, "I am willing. Be clean." Matthew tells us that immediately the man was cleansed. But there is something deeper happening here. The power of Jesus moves in the opposite direction from what the crowd expected. Normally, uncleanness was something associated with separation. But when Jesus touched this man, Jesus was not overcome by his condition. The man's uncleanness was overcome by Jesus' cleansing power. This is one of the most powerful images in the entire miracle. Jesus was not contaminated by the man. Instead, the man was transformed by Jesus. And imagine what that touch must have meant. It was more than physical contact. It was compassion breaking through isolation. It was mercy crossing a boundary. It was hope entering a life that had been defined by rejection. For everyone else, the man was someone to avoid. For Jesus, he was someone worth approaching. And in that single touch, the crowd witnessed something that would become a defining feature of Jesus' ministry. He had authority over what others feared. But the miracle was not finished, because Jesus was about to connect this man's healing to something much older than that moment, something written centuries earlier. And that is where the hidden mystery begins. The man had come asking to be made clean, and Jesus did exactly that. But if we stop at the physical healing, we miss something enormous. This miracle was about restoration. The man had not simply been suffering in his body. His condition had affected his place within the community. His life had been marked by separation. Now everything was changing. He had been excluded. Now he could return. He had been avoided. Now he could be seen differently. He had carried the label unclean. Now Jesus had declared him clean. And then Jesus gave him an unexpected command. Go, show yourself to the priest. Why? Because according to the instructions recorded in Leviticus, the priest had an important role in examining a person who had been healed and declaring that person clean. Jesus was not treating God's earlier revelation as meaningless. Instead, he was demonstrating that the man's cleansing was real, but now something fascinating begins to emerge. The miracle happened in the presence of Jesus, yet the priest was supposed to examine the result. In other words, Jesus performed the cleansing and then sent the man to the very system that could officially recognize his restoration. And this raises a question. Why did Jesus deliberately connect his miracle to the ancient laws of Leviticus? Was this simply about one man's healing? Or was Jesus revealing something much greater? To find the answer, we have to travel backwards centuries before Bethlehem, before the crowds, before Jesus stood beside this suffering man. Because the mystery of this miracle was already waiting in the pages of Scripture. Centuries before Jesus walked the roads of Galilee, the book of Leviticus established a powerful pattern. Uncleanness required separation, examination, and cleansing. Leviticus 13 deals with the identification of certain skin diseases. Leviticus 14 then describes what happened when a person was healed and needed to be declared clean and restored. Now watch what happens when Jesus enters the story. A man who has been identified as unclean comes directly to him. Jesus touches him. Jesus commands cleansing. And then Jesus tells him to go to the priest. The connection is impossible to ignore. But there is an important distinction. Scripture does not explicitly say that this miracle was a coded prediction of the Messiah in the way a direct prophecy might be. Instead, the miracle echoes the Old Testament pattern of cleansing and restoration and reveals Jesus' authority within that biblical framework. And that makes the moment even more fascinating. Jesus is standing at the intersection of two worlds. Behind him is the law, with its categories of clean and unclean. Before him is the kingdom he is announcing. And in front of him stands a man who represents everything the community fears. Yet Jesus moves toward him. The deeper biblical pattern is beginning to emerge. Brokenness, cleansing, restoration. And this pattern will eventually lead us to the greatest question of all. If Jesus can cleanse a man's body with a word, what else did he come to cleanse? The answer reaches beyond this miracle. It reaches into the human heart and ultimately to the cross. There was something deeply unusual about the way Jesus interacted with the unclean. In the biblical system, uncleanness meant separation. But Jesus repeatedly moved toward the people. Others pushed away. And here, the direction of the story seems to reverse. The man approaches Jesus carrying uncleanness. Jesus touches him, and the man walks away cleansed. Jesus' holiness is not defeated by the man's condition. Instead, Jesus' authority overcomes it. This is not merely a dramatic detail. It reveals something about the person standing before the crowd. Jesus was not simply another teacher explaining the law. He was demonstrating authority that reached into the very condition that had separated this man from others. And imagine what that meant spiritually. For years, this man had heard the message, "Stay away." But Jesus' actions communicated something entirely different. Come. The crowd saw contamination. Jesus saw restoration. The crowd saw a problem. Jesus saw a person. And the spiritual battle unfolding in that moment was not fought with weapons. It was a confrontation between everything that had driven this man into isolation and the mercy of God now reaching toward him. But there is an even deeper layer. The Old Testament prophets had spoken of God's servant bearing human suffering and bringing restoration. Isaiah 53 would later become one of the clearest passages Christians connected with the suffering Messiah. So this healing gives us another glimpse of Jesus' mission. He came not merely to make people comfortable. He came to confront brokenness, to restore what was lost, and ultimately, to deal with humanity's deepest separation from God. The man had just experienced something impossible. He had been cleansed. He had been restored. And Jesus had every reason to let the miracle become public evidence of his power. Yet Jesus gave him a surprising instruction. See that you say nothing to anyone. Why would Jesus say that? Why silence a testimony this powerful? Because Jesus' mission was never about becoming a celebrity. He wasn't chasing crowds simply for the sake of crowds. Throughout his ministry, Jesus repeatedly confronted the danger of people misunderstanding his identity and mission. Many wanted a miracle worker. Many wanted a political deliverer. Many wanted a Messiah who would satisfy their expectations. But Jesus came according to the Father's purpose. The miracle was a sign, but the sign was never meant to replace the message. And this creates an important spiritual lesson for us. We live in a world that measures influence by visibility. More views, more followers, more applause, more recognition. But Jesus shows us something different. Obedience comes before popularity. The healed man had a testimony, but Jesus wanted him to follow his instruction. And perhaps there is a question here for every believer. Would you still obey God if nobody applauded? Would you still follow him if your obedience remained unseen? Because real faith is not proven only by what we say publicly. It is revealed by what we do when nobody is watching. Yet despite Jesus' command, the news spread. The miracle could not easily be hidden. And as the story continued, Jesus' fame increased. But the most important question remained. What exactly had Jesus restored? Because the man's body had changed, but his entire life was about to change with it. Imagine the moment this man walked away from Jesus. For years, his condition had defined his existence, but now something had changed. The person who once had to remain separated could begin the journey back into ordinary community life. He could be seen without the same fear. He could be examined by the priest. He could be officially recognized as clean. And perhaps most importantly, he could begin rebuilding a life that had been interrupted. This is why the miracle is bigger than physical healing. Jesus didn't simply change the man's condition, he changed his future. And that is where this ancient story begins to speak directly to us. Because sometimes we ask God to fix one problem, while God is working on something much deeper. We ask for relief. God may be restoring hope. We ask for a door to open. God may be rebuilding our purpose. We ask for our circumstances to change. God may be changing who we are becoming through them. The leper came to Jesus carrying a condition he could not remove himself. He didn't pretend everything was fine. He didn't hide his need. He came honestly, and Jesus met him with mercy. That doesn't mean every prayer produces an immediate physical miracle. Scripture itself shows faithful people who continued to suffer while trusting God. But this story reveals something unchanging. Jesus is not repelled by the brokenness we bring to him. And that leads to the question we cannot avoid. If Jesus was willing to reach toward this man in his uncleanness, what are you carrying that you are afraid to bring to Jesus? Because the miracle is about to move from the leper's story to yours. Now the story becomes deeply personal. The man who came to Jesus carried something everyone could see. But what about the things we carry that nobody else can see? Maybe it is shame from yesterday. Maybe it is regret over a decision you wish you could undo. Maybe it is fear that has quietly controlled your choices. Maybe it is guilt, disappointment, bitterness, or a wound you have carried for years. The world often teaches us to hide these things. Smile, pretend, keep moving. But this man did something different. He came to Jesus exactly as he was. He didn't first make himself acceptable. He didn't try to prove that he deserved mercy. He simply fell before Jesus and admitted his need. And that is one of the most beautiful truths hidden inside this miracle. You don't come to Jesus because you have already become clean. You come to Jesus because you need his cleansing. That doesn't mean Jesus ignores sin or tells us that brokenness doesn't matter. It means his grace meets us in our need and calls us toward transformation. The man had spent years hearing the message, "Stay away," but Jesus showed him that mercy was not afraid to come near. And perhaps someone watching this needs to hear that today. Your failure is not greater than God's grace. Your past is not more powerful than Christ's mercy. Your weakness does not make Jesus turn away. Bring it to him. Bring the fear. Bring the shame. Bring the questions. Bring the part of your story you wish you could erase. Because the one who reached toward the leper is still the one who calls broken people toward restoration. And now we reach the greatest revelation of all. This miracle points beyond cleansing the body to the cleansing Christ came to accomplish through the cross. The leper needed cleansing, but Jesus came to accomplish something far greater than restoring one man's body. He came to deal with the deepest problem, separating humanity from God. The Bible presents sin as a problem that reaches far deeper than outward appearance. It affects the heart, our relationship with God, and ultimately our need for redemption. And suddenly, the miracle takes on a greater meaning. The leper stood separated from the community. Sin separates humanity from God. The leper needed restoration. Humanity needs reconciliation. The leper could not simply declare himself clean, and humanity cannot save itself by pretending to be righteous. But Jesus came toward the broken. He came toward the lost. He came toward those who knew they needed mercy. And the hand that reached out to touch the leper would one day be stretched out upon a cross. Not because Jesus had lost his authority, not because evil had defeated him, but because the cross was part of the mission he came to fulfill. Isaiah 53 speaks of the servant bearing human suffering, and Christians understand this passage as pointing ultimately to Christ's redemptive suffering. So the miracle becomes a window into the gospel. The man came to Jesus asking, "Make me clean." And Jesus answered with mercy. But at the cross, Jesus would carry the burden of sin and open the way for reconciliation with God. That is the greater cleansing. The leper walked away restored to his community. Through Christ, sinners can be restored to relationship with God. And now the ancient story reaches its final question. If Jesus was willing to touch the man everyone else avoided, will you trust him with the broken places in your own life? Go back with me to that moment. The crowd is watching. The man is kneeling. Everyone knows what he carries. Everyone knows what the law says about uncleanness. And then Jesus steps toward him. He reaches out his hand, and with a touch and a word, the story changes. The man who had been separated is restored. The man who had been avoided is welcomed. The man who had carried the label unclean walks away cleansed. But the greatest message of this miracle is not simply that Jesus healed a leper 2,000 years ago. It is that Jesus has authority to restore what human beings cannot restore by themselves. Your story may look different. Your struggle may not be visible. Your questions may be different from the questions this man carried. But the invitation remains. Bring it to Jesus. Don't wait until you have everything figured out. Don't wait until you feel worthy. Don't wait until you can explain every question. Come with faith. Come with humility. Come with the simple prayer. Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And remember this, God's answer is not always the immediate outcome we expect, but his character remains faithful, and his grace is not limited by the places where we feel most broken. So if this story has spoken to you, take a moment today and bring your deepest need before God. And if you believe Jesus is still the one who restores, write, "Jesus, make me clean," in the comments. Share this message with someone who needs hope, because sometimes the person who feels furthest away from God is the very person who needs to hear this truth. You are not beyond the reach of Jesus.